Let's talk now for a little bit about the idea of the 1920s as the Roaring Twenties, this age of excitement and kind of wild activity going on. One of the early and very famous historians of the 1920s referred to this era as the ballyhoo years. Ballyhoo is not a word that we use much anymore, but it kind of means filled with bombast and excitement and sort of overblown events, the years of ballyhoo. And it does seem that the 1920s were a time of great heroes, epic events, fantastic trials, huge moments, and lots of these sorts of things. In some ways, we might look back and say that some of that is myth, that the 1920s were no more than any other decade filled with these kinds of stories. But we can also say that this is related to the way Americans thought about themselves at that time and the way they thought about events at that time. Perhaps average and normal stories that weren't all that important seemed more important in this age of ballyhoo. Part of this is because this is an age of mass production, not only of automobiles and products, but of news and news stories. The country is becoming a nation of faddists, everyone drawn to the same stories at the same time. The media is becoming much more adept at selling us on stories and getting us to purchase their newspapers and magazines and read and listen to the stories that they want us to. And this is evidenced by the headlines of the day. Front page stories became dominated by gigantic headlines, and even stories that weren't really all that significant become these front page stories with huge headlines. And you see the newspaper there describing the flight of Charles Lindbergh, which we'll mention shortly. But we become a nation that's just sort of caught up in whatever the latest event is, whatever the latest fad coming around of the time seems to be. The 1920s was an age of fads, as the nation seemed to be swept along by a series of crazes that overtook everyone. And again, mass media is part of this, as we are all kind of exposed to the same things during this time. Among the first was the Chinese game of mahjong, introduced to the United States in 1920 by a businessman traveling abroad. By 1922 or 23, mahjong had become a national craze. Leagues and teams were formed all over the country, and it was common to hear Americans debating the rules of the game or the finer points of strategy in water cooler discussions. In the mid-1920s, another craze swept the nation, a craze for crossword puzzles. A young man named Richard Simon in 1924. Simon was a crossword enthusiast who was growing frustrated that he could only get one crossword each day in the newspaper. And so he decided to form a publishing company with his friend whose name was Schuster, Simon and Schuster. That might not be a familiar name to you, but it remains a very prominent publishing house even today. And they started their publishing house purely in the interest of publishing crossword books. And they churned out bestseller after bestseller. The nation was swept up in a craze for crosswords. Dictionaries were selling off the shelves. Thesauruses were selling off the shelves. And the entire country was swept along. Within just another year or two, 1926 or 27, the nation became obsessed with trivia contests. And a little bit later in the decade, 27 or 28, it was card games, table games, and particularly contract bridge, which I don't know if any of you play bridge or are familiar with it, but it's a 4-person game you play in teams of 2. It's very convenient for small parties at the house or entertaining. And so the country, one after another, is swept up in these national crazes. In the 1920s, the nation is also swept along by what seems to be an endless series of huge headline news stories. Every story, every event seemed more important than the last. And again, the national media, national newspapers, radio, all playing a role in this idea of kind of inflating news stories. In 1921, the discovery of King Tut's tomb in Egypt was a huge story. The 1924 Olympics became a huge story. And late in 1924 and into 1925, the story of a young man named Floyd Collins, a young boy who slipped into the Mammoth Cave in Kentucky. He was trapped in a narrow crevasse, and there was a huge effort to try to save him, with crews of men trying to climb down and send him food and water down on lines and trying to dig down and get him. And eventually Floyd Collins died February 17th, 1925. But this was a front page story for weeks and weeks. Later in 1925, it was the Scopes trial, which I mentioned to you in the introduction, a huge and genuinely important story. In 1926, it was the epic voyage of Admiral Richard Byrd and his crew traveling to the South Pole with the goal of ultimately flying over the South Pole in an airplane, which Richard Byrd ultimately did successfully. In 1926, the death of the actor Rudolph Valentino, one of the first male sex symbols, grabbed front page headlines. And then in 1927, perhaps the most enduring and important story of the entire decade, the flight of Charles Lindbergh. This story may very well be familiar to you. He remains a famous historical figure. But of course, Lindbergh is known for his solo flight from New York to Paris, which left New York on a rainy morning on May 20th, 1927. And one of the interesting things about Lindbergh's flight is that in that era, it was still very difficult, if not impossible, to have any contact with a flight like that after they had left the mainland. And there had been several attempts to make a flight like this before. And so after Lindbergh took off, he was sighted briefly for a few moments north of Canada on his way, and then kind of sailed off into the unknown. And the entire country, and in fact the entire world, for the next day or so was gripped by this story and the uncertainty of whether he would actually reach Paris successfully or not. And then when his flight was sighted as it came in over Europe, and particularly upon his arrival in Paris, the world was just seized with this incredible joy and excitement over this. Actually, Lindbergh's flight contributed to a cementing of positive relations between France and the United States, which is a different story, but it really contributed to a period of goodwill, almost including the entire globe in this. And so Lindbergh's flight is not just one of these kind of empty headline stories. It was really a significant news story. Among the other things that Lindbergh's flight did was just to ensure the significance of air travel and flight. There were a lot of people that had doubts about whether air travel would ever be successful. But in the aftermath of Lindbergh's flight, people were much more reassured that it could be done safely, and it's not much longer down the road that we start to introduce commercial airline flights. And finally, Lindbergh's accomplishment cemented him as one of the great heroes of the age. And for a time, certainly Lindbergh was the most well-known and popular figure in the entire world. And why not? I mean, you look at him here, he is dashing, he's handsome, he's young, he's courageous, and he's accomplished this incredible, unprecedented feat, making Lindbergh one of a number of heroes in what is sometimes known as the Age of Heroes. The 1920s, I described to you very briefly a little bit earlier, the idea of celebrity and fame. And heroes is another way of thinking about that. And we see them in a number of walks of life. There are these kind of daredevils. There are these explorers like Richard Byrd and like Charles Lindbergh. But there are other figures as well that come to be known by the entire country, and among them are a series of great sports heroes. The 1920s are sometimes known as the golden age of sport. There do seem to be, in every sport, transcendent figures, great superstars, and outstanding practitioners of whatever the sport might be. But in many cases, transcending sport and beginning to penetrate broader society as well. In almost every sport, there are all-time greats, household names. In golf, this was the age of the rivalry between Bobby Jones, the amateur's amateur, the designer of the Augusta National Golf Course, and Walter Hagen, the pro's pro, known for his lavish spending, fancy clothes, and things of that nature. And these two clashed in a number of epic golf tournaments. In college football, there were a number of figures, but perhaps the most famous was Newt Rockne, the head football coach at Notre Dame, one of the most recognizable men in the country. There were female sports stars as well. Gertrude Ederle became world famous. She was the first woman to swim across the English Channel, which she did in 1925, and in fact doing it in record time, beating all of the records that had been established, of course, by men. Many of these superstars are particularly famous not just because they were good at their sports or even great at their sports, but there are a couple of themes that seem to be common among almost all of these sports stars. One of them is that they came from modest beginnings. They represented for us the possibility of rags to riches tales, dangling the possibility that any of us might rise from obscurity or from poverty, from humble beginnings, to the heights of fame and success and wealth. The other thing that these heroes seem to share is, again, not just that they are great at their sports, but that they transform their sports. Their greatness is so far and above what anyone else is doing that they actually change the way their sports are played. All of these things are certainly true of Red Grange, who was the best-known football player of his era. Red Grange was the son of an ice delivery man, leading to one of the great nicknames. Actually, Red Grange has two of the great nicknames in all of sports history, but one of them being the Iceman of Wheaton. You see him in the bottom picture there on sort of a publicity trip back home after he's achieved success, and he's carrying one of those blocks of ice, which he did with his father when he was growing up. Red Grange achieved fame when he was at the University of Illinois. And it was particularly the game against Michigan in 1924 that cemented his fame. Michigan was one of the top teams in the country. They had the top defense in the country. I don't remember the exact statistic, but this was the fourth or fifth game of the year, and Michigan had only allowed a handful of points in the entire season. Red Grange scored 4 touchdowns in the first 12 minutes of the game. And these weren't just any kind of touchdowns. They were all fantastic, lightning-quick, long runs, a kickoff return of 95 yards, and runs from scrimmage of 67, 56, and 45 yards. This in an age when football was a lot like rugby in that it was a very physical, violent game of plunging into the line, 1-yard gains, 2-yard gains. Any positive gain was remarkable. And here comes Red Grange, not only gaining positive yardage, but these long breakaway spectacular runs really transformed the way the game was played. The other great impact that Red Grange had was that it was Grange in many ways who first illustrated the legitimacy of professional football. Red Grange, after graduating from the University of Illinois, made the remarkable decision to go on to play professional football. This was in an age when the NFL was really in its infancy. The NFL was a rough and tumble game of roughnecks and thugs and flunkies. This was not a sport for college graduates. College men went on to careers in business or law or politics. They didn't dirty themselves and sully themselves by rambling around on the football field. Red Grange changed that. He immediately, out of college, signed a contract with the Chicago Bears in 1925. Went on to play 10 games in 17 days. Now, obviously, the scheduling was quite a bit different at that time. Barnstorming all around the country, playing 14 more games in the next 35 days. So he's played 24 games in something like 2 months in 1925. Obviously, this took wear and tear on his body, but it also made him among the most famous athletes in the country at that time, and he raked in a lot of money in doing that. This also secured the place of professional football and what becomes the NFL in the American consciousness. If there is a superstar among superstars, a transcendent figure above all others, it is Babe Ruth. Certainly you're all familiar with Babe Ruth. He was the most famous athlete in the age of many famous athletes. And of course, baseball was his sport. As we saw with Red Grange, Babe Ruth came from humble beginnings. He was a bartender's son. He was a troubled youth, eventually sent away to a home for troubled boys as a young teenager. And it was there that he was introduced to the sport of baseball and found that he was gifted above anyone else. You may not know, he was a great pitcher before and as well as being a tremendous hitter. And actually in his first handful of years in the major leagues, he was one of the top pitchers. He still actually holds a handful of records among pitchers that last even to this day. But of course it is his hitting for which he is best known. And as we saw with Red Grange and his long breakaway touchdown runs, in the case of Babe Ruth, it was the home run that transformed the game. Babe Ruth played initially in what was known as the dead ball era. It was an age in which hitters were known for sort of slapping the ball, just knock it out of the infield as best you can, and running the bases was really the prime objective of the game. It wasn't until Babe Ruth entered the scene that players, teams, pitchers, coaches, everyone began to really have to think about the home run as part of the strategy. Over those first few years in the league, Babe Ruth frequently hit more home runs by himself in a season than entire teams hit all put together. Babe Ruth becomes the most popular and best-known athlete of his age. It wasn't just that he was a great athlete or that he had this kind of compelling rags-to-riches backstory, but also Babe Ruth was beloved because he was such a regular guy. In the age of consumption, he was the ultimate consumer. He was known for his prodigious eating and drinking habits. He would frequently eat hot dogs while sitting on the bench during a game. He would frequently go out all night drinking beer the night before a game and come back the next day to hit several home runs and star in the game. He also made many public appearances. He appeared in vaudeville many different times. He was the biggest promoter of products in that day, advertising things like hunting and fishing equipment, shoes and cars and food and all kinds of other things. He became without question the transcendent star in an age of transcendent stars. I want to mention one other great sports star of this age, Jack Dempsey, who at times may have been the best known, the most famous of all of the sports stars, including Babe Ruth himself. Jack Dempsey was the heavyweight boxing champion through much of the 1920s. And like the others, he represents this kind of rags-to-riches tale, rising from obscurity to the heights of fame and prominence. But he also transformed his sport. In the case of Jack Dempsey, it is the knockout in boxing. Prior to Jack Dempsey, boxing was the sweet science. It was all about sort of peppering your opponent, and bouts could go on for dozens and dozens of rounds. In fact, there are a number of fights that lasted more than 100 rounds prior to Jack Dempsey. When Dempsey came on the scene, he brought with him the knockout, and not just the knockout, but the spectacular, often first-round knockout, bludgeoning his opponents into submission in just a matter of seconds. And so he's something like a Mike Tyson type of figure in this era. Early in his career, he had several bouts in which he destroyed much bigger men in the ring. In 1919, when he won the heavyweight championship, he defeated a man named Jess Willard, who was a much bigger opponent. In 1921, I mentioned to you his fight with Georges Carpentier, the first $1 Million Gate and one of the first marquee radio events in history. And then in 1923, one of the most spectacular boxing matches of all time, the fight pictured in the painting you see on your screen. He fought the Italian or Argentinian champion Luis Firpo, who has one of the great nicknames in sports history, the Wild Bull of the Pampas, coming from the wilds of Argentina. The bout lasted only 2 rounds, but it was a spectacular bout, with Firpo being knocked down 8 times, including the final knockout. But prior to that, Dempsey himself was knocked down 3 times, including once in which he was knocked out of the ring. And you actually see the painting here above, the artist transforming history somewhat. It was Dempsey who was knocked out of the ring, and Firpo who should have been standing in the ring, but the artist here has Dempsey knocking Firpo out of the ring. But this was a spectacular match. Dempsey may be best known for his 2 bouts against Gene Tunney, heavyweight championship bouts in 1926 and 1927. More than 100,000 people packed stadiums to watch both bouts, and they became huge draws on the radio. With the second bout, it's said that 40 million people listened to that bout on the radio. There are many other examples of this, but these are three of the largest sports stars of their era. They illustrate to you the idea of fame and celebrity and the idea of these rags to riches stories, but also in each case we see athletes transforming their sports, having an impact that reaches well beyond just the ring or the field, penetrating the day-to-day lives of Americans.